Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start with just a few thank yous. Thanks to the audience today for coming along and through the fascinating talks. Our speakers as well, and they've kept on time, which is not always the case with Labour History conferences in the past. We'd just like to thank the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media. The sessions here in Liberty Hall today are all being streamed live. And Dublin City Council as well, so they're online as well. We do have an online audience as well, so we'd like to thank them and the wider trade union movement for this conference, and you as delegates as well towards your contribution. So this is the final formal talk of tonight before the book launch and importantly the glass of wine. So we have Dr. John Cunningham of University of Galway. John probably doesn't need any introduction to many of us. Immediately after this talk. So, Dr. John Cunningham.
Oopsie. So my slides, this is my, controls my slide, is it?
Yeah.
Next and back, okay. Right, okay. Oopsie. Just to make sure that you hear me. Is that right? Is that better? Okay. Right. So, a chomrádaithe agus a chomhleacachaí agus a cháirde. Yeah, I'll say it again later, yes. The Great Famine was a turning point in Irish history, with consequences that reverberated for decades and arguably still reverberate. Most usually mentioned is the impact on population arising from famine, mortality and migration. Just last year there was some excitement, I suppose, when census returns showed that population had for the first time exceeded the post-famine total of 6.6 million, still far short of the pre-famine total on the island of 8.2 million. But population is but one measure of the famine's impacts, and bald statistics, of course, gloss over a range of tragic consequences. It's acknowledged that the famine, oopsie, not close enough? Right. Okay. It's acknowledged that the famine was a social tragedy and a cultural tragedy, but it was also a labour tragedy. For those most affected were the labouring and cottier families of the country. At the Labour History Society seemed to recognise this at its foundation. For the very first issue of Saher in 1975 had an article by Gregor O'Dowell entitled "Galway in the First Famine Winter." But that was it. There's been a scattering of book reviews since, but no further article on the famine has been published in the journal. The famine, of course, looms large in general histories, so Labour historians may have considered it could be safely left in other hands. But arguably there have been consequences. Historians generally have been dutifully sympathetic towards famine casualties, but when the dead or the displaced are represented, whether in books or in monuments, they're invariably shown as helpless victims. This, while not exactly false, is not the full story, and it denies the agency of those represented. A Labour perspective can correct this. The fact is that the men and women of the labouring class did not passively allow their children to sicken and die, as Michael Davitt once wrote. Till they were overwhelmed by hunger and by military force, people did valiantly try to prevent foodstuffs from being removed from their communities. Unquestionably, the largest working class protest movement in Irish history took place in the months of September, October into early November 1846, when hundreds of thousands mobilised on roads, quays and waterways so as to secure a share of the country's, their entitlement to a share in the country's diminished resources. The opening slide, the first one there, showed a mobilisation in Dungarvan, County Waterford during this period. And in a moment, I'll look at the composition and the objectives of these mobilisations. Another compelling reason for examining the famine through a labour lens is that manual labour was the mechanism in the early famine period for the dispensing of relief. Under the auspices of the Board of Works, there were 734,000 people employed on schemes at the end of 1 week in March 1847, making the Board of Works the largest ever employer in Ireland. If we employed more, in fact, than the combined total of public servants, public employees employed in the two jurisdictions at the present time. Now, before looking at relief schemes, I look at the great mobilisations and blockades, the high point of which was in the autumn of 1846, the point at which the crisis was becoming acute. And I just emphasise again that I'm looking at collective action to achieve social objectives, that is, retaining food in the country and in communities, rather than at appropriation or theft or anything like that. There had been years of scarcity before the famine period, and in 1845, there was no reason to assume that the partial failure of the potato crop was anything out of the ordinary. The total failure of 1846 put a different complexion on things, and crisis gripped the country. The great mobilisation that swept Munster in particular drew on repertoires of protest stretching back to the 18th century, repertoires associated with two phenomena in particular, an urban food rioting tradition and a mainly rural white boy tradition. As we'll see, there were other elements to the popular mobilisations, including a trade union element. I think I have a map here. Some of the mobilisations, emphasising again, this is from a 2-month period, and you'll see the kind of geographical the spread of them, a lot of them, but concentrated in a triangle, as it were. Now, with regard to food riots and white boys, E.P. Thompson's concept of moral economy is relevant. Moral economy being a type of social, which has been mentioned already, being a type of social contract informed by a wider consensus that people had the right to eat. The right was supported by legislation and by custom historically, until it was challenged by the political economists, notably Adam Smith, from the late 18th century. Traditional protections had included measures against profiteering in food, such as abuses such as forestalling, the holding back of food in order to force a price rise. Moreover, governments had routinely intervened to ban food exports, to ban the feeding of grain to army horses, to ban distilling during years of scarcity. Now, such measures ran counter to the free trade doctrines of the political economists, whose ideas became the new common sense, and there was a logic to them which I won't go into for reasons of time. Not everybody, of course, accepts the new worldview, and people continue to expect the authorities to intervene in the ways they had in the past. And when the authorities did not act, people acted themselves, essentially, so-called food rioters mobilising to demand, acted themselves. In Galway, to give an example, the Claddagh fishing community on occasion confiscated the sails of ships involved in the food trade, took them down, stuck them under the thatch, and used them as collateral in bargaining with exporting merchants. Andres Eriksson and James Kelly have published important research on this general phenomenon in Ireland. By way of example, there's two items here. Where are we? Here we are. These are both from Galway, as it happens, indicating what I said about a tradition, a repertoire of protests going back into several generations previously. The first one is a threatening notice which was posted on the Tolsel Gate, the town hall gate, in 1817, threatening named merchants, Joyce, Hines, and other rascals, I think is the phrase of the note, and headlined bread or blood. So threatening consequences if people don't desist from removing food from the community. And I suppose the key thing to understand here is in the era before rail and so on and well-developed roads, you have very localized markets. So an export, as it was described from an area, might lead to a sudden increase in prices. For that particular reason, the food trade was suspect. So we have the threatening notice against the merchants and threatening the ship captains for good measure that their vessels would be burned. The other Galway image from the Illustrated London News in 1842 shows a conflict between forestallers, speculators in food, and market customers, with women prominently involved. And this is a common feature of such encounters. Women take the lead. Both notice and engraving suggest violence, but this wasn't actually the reality. As a Limerick newspaper put it in 1840, in describing a food protest in that city, quote, "Not an ounce of grain or flour was laid hold of by the people, although if they chose, they could have rifled the entire contents of the establishment." That wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was to make the food available at a fair price in the community. So urban food riots then were generally restrained and disciplined affairs, involving, in E.P. Thompson's phrase, collective bargaining by riot. There was intimidation, certainly, but little actual violence. The fact was that the crowd saw itself as the moral actor, defending established law and custom. The criminal welfare. An export and distilling ban in 1845-46. But neither political pressure or popular action was sufficient to keep the grain at home in 1846-47. But determined efforts were made to keep it in Ireland. Traditions of protest in places like Limerick, Ennis, and Galway, as I've mentioned, indicated to the authorities where trouble might be anticipated. And the captains of Admiralty vessels, vessels that were sent to distribute Indian meal, were instructed, quote again, to preserve their efficiency as men of war and assist the civil powers in the case of outbreak. The Stromboli, which was one of 12 men of war, was placed in the river by the Claddagh and in both Limerick and in Galway in 1846. Catholic clergy intervened to assist the authorities in suppressing protest. So there were mobilizations in those places, but they didn't achieve their objectives because they were overwhelmed by superior and disciplined force. The successful anti-export mobilisations of 1846 were in places with less developed traditions where the authorities were not forewarned. Take Westport, County Mayo, where at 5 a.m. on the 21st of September 1846, 600 or 700 people blocked access to the quays, declaring that they wouldn't, quote, allow 1 grain of corn to leave the country, and forcing then the return of a convoy of merchants' carts without, according to the police, offering the slightest violence, except, of course, the sheer numbers. A week later, thousands mustered on the outskirts of Dungarvan, County Waterford, where soldiers were deployed to protect ships carrying grain exports. As occurred previously in Galway, at this is autumn 1846. Now, I skipped a slide, which I should go back to. So some of the types of issues that I'm talking about, the circumstances of mobilisation. I've been talking about the seaborne exports so far, so I'm going to talk about some of the others now. So other sites of contention, apart from the seaports, were the inland waterways. Again, there's a tradition here going back a generation or two since the building of the canals, with Dublin-bound potatoes and grain obstructed in earlier decades during years of shortage on the Royal and the Grand Canals. In 1846, military reinforcements were deployed in canal-side villages and towns. The effective blockade in the autumn of 1846 in the inland waterways took place in the rivers Blackwater and Shannon, and I'll talk about those in a moment. We got, yeah, that's the Blackwater, I think. Yep. Correspondence shows that Baron Stuart de Decies of the Villiers-Stuart kind of political family requested that a war steamer be sent to the Blackwater to reopen the corn trade, as he put it, which had been, quote, entirely suspended between Lismore, Cappoquin and Youghal, owing to the opposition made by the peasantry to the passage of corn. Elsewhere, at O'Brien's Bridge on the Shannon, several thousand people gathered at Deniston's mill to prevent grain being taken to the Limerick market, and extracted a promise from the mill owner to sell his meal locally at 2 shillings and 8pence a stone, guaranteeing the miller that they would persuade the farmers to supply him at a rate below that. Something precisely similar happened in Scariff in the same county. Here and indeed over most of Clare, the predominant model of social protest was white boyism, with Lady Clare's Boys and Terry Alts active in the decades before the famine. Peaceful daytime crowds, including women, while white boyism is young men and out at night and regarded as and violent indeed. There are, however, many examples of rural crowds mobilizing in daytime under the banners of white boy type entities. and white boyism wasn't as egregiously violent as it has sometimes been represented. And this is borne out by recent nuanced work by Terry Dunn, who features in the volume which is being launched later, and Michael Huggins on Roscommon. Where white boyism did resemble urban food protest was in a form of moral economy, not one buttressed by formal legislation or even bylaw, but nonetheless upholding a value system, an unwritten law, as it were, opposing evictions, the employment of strangers while locals are unemployed, and maintaining wage rates. For George Cornwall Lewis, a public official writing in the 1830s, white boyism was, quote, a vast trade union for the protection of the Irish peasantry, the object being to regulate the relationships between landlord and tenant to the benefit of the latter. Now, Terry Alts are busy, clearly, during the famine in Clare. At Ballykilty in the county in November 1846, a notice warned farmers not to send corn to market and, quote, not to charge more than 1 and 6pence per stone at home. Again, this is the rate which they had set for supplying the millers in Scariff and in O'Brien's Bridge. So there's kind of a notion of a fair price there. Farmers were beaten as punishment for selling corn, and horses were shot dead on their way with corn to the market at Ennis, and also after returning from the Limerick market in several places in County Clare on the same night in September 1846. One of the most remarkable protest waves of the period was in the DCs of West Waterford, the stomping ground, some of you will be aware, of rival Caravats and Shanavests, representing respectively labourers and farmers in the 1810s, and the subject of Dominic Hoch's article in the volume that we'll be launching in a while. And also of rival Paulines and Gows a few decades later. Here, the cottier labourers who were employed by farmers were mostly paid in kind in the form of an acre on which to grow potatoes. It might take a labourer 200 days of toil to pay his annual potato ground debt to the farmer, according to evidence given to the Devon Commission in the early 1840s. Wage and conacre rent levels then determined the cottier labourer's access to his family's staple food as much as the market price did for the urban dweller. In late September 1846, labourers from throughout the region assembled in crowds of some thousands outside the houses of employers who had paid them in potato ground, which was now useless because of the blight. Quote from one witness, "The crop having failed, they considered it just to obtain their money." The farmers evidently conceded in the face of threats to burn their haggards. There were similar mobilizations elsewhere, but none on the scale, or none has been discovered on the scale of West Waterford. Moving on, with regard to the public works, which I mentioned at the outset, mobilizations show a sense of entitlement. In September 1846, 500 men and boys, have I 5 minutes, Kevin? Just about, good. 500 men and boys visited several gentlemen's houses near Omagh, County Tyrone, demanding employment. In a number of places in County Cork, landlords' livestock was kidnapped, distrained, whatever, and held hostage unto demanding that the landlords establish public works or expedite public works. More dramatically, back in Waterford, in Dungarvan, on the night of 13th of September 1846, fires were lit on hills around on uplands around the area in order to pressurise property owners, especially ahead of special presentment sessions in the town. On the day of the sessions, 4,000 people, estimated again, surrounded the courthouse and refused to permit those attending to leave until they gave guarantees about the establishment of relief works and about wages, what wages would be on those relief works. In Kells, County Meath, in November, those attending the presentment sessions there were similarly detained until they gave a positive answer to the people's demands. Significant from the labourers' point of view, the new Whig government of July 1846 changed relief works from day rates to piece rates. I've mentioned the 734,000 employed on relief works in March 1847. Obviously, this was an administrative nightmare, unsustainable, and there was an end to the policy and the opening of soup kitchens. But obviously, piecework, work paid by results, introduced paradoxically at a time when reproductive or useful public works were essentially banned by the government. This piecework is obviously severe on bodies weakened by malnourishment in the winter of 1846. There are occasions of tension, delayed wages, the introduction of piecework, and so on was opposed. So there are numberless protests and strikes on these schemes, and some attention has been paid to these by historians. Militancy was clearly rewarded in places, as indicated by a Board of Works report on armed Terry Alts and striking labourers near Gort, County Galway, in South County Galway. All along the borders, went the report, all along the borders of County Clare, men are in a state of insubordination, as they know that the Clare men get a shilling a day, and they say they are dissatisfied with their own eightpence. And they will not undertake task work. So the Terry Alts essentially had 50% premium on relief work wages in County Clare over the board, over County Galway. In 20 minutes, there's are aspects of the labour history of the famine that I can't address. One of the most important, the influence of Irish famine emigrants on emergent labour movements elsewhere, is treated in the chapter by Marcel van der Linden in the book that we'll be launching. I will mention, though, one famine emigrant for kind of sentimental reasons. This is Kate Mullany, who left County Roscommon in 1847, was a founder of the Collar Workers Union in Troy, upstate New York, and was the first woman to hold national office in the United States labour movement. I haven't got into the strikes. Most of these were in relief works, but some were on the major infrastructural works of the period, the rail and so on. I'll mention the 1,700 men at Mullingar who struck in December 1846, opposing a wage reduction which had been prompted by the shorter winter working day. Infrastructural projects, moreover, required skilled labour. So there, unexpectedly, I suppose, labour shortages during the famine, shortages of skilled labour, which was taken advantage of by artisans on occasion. Just take an example from my own workplace. I'll mention the Galway carpenters and masons who took action, including strike in 1847, to maintain traditional restrictions on apprentices and to exclude strangers from employment on the construction of the new Eglinton Canal and Queen's College, Galway. I've sketched ongoing and existing research with some of the detail drawn from my article in the commemorative volume that's being launched after this talk. Concluding, I'd argue for the potential for developing a history from below of the famine, encompassing social protest, public works, immigration, including its effect on those left behind, circumstances in workhouses, and so on. Sources are couched in a prose of counterinsurgency to use Ranajit Guha's phrase. They require careful reading against the grain, for which labour historians are singularly qualified. Local studies are vital to an understanding of this critical moment in the formation and shaping of the Irish working class, and they are necessary if we want to restore agency to the people who faced starvation in 1846 and Black 47. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much.
Can I sit down?
We have about, thanks very much, John, really lots of food for thought in that talk there. We also, you teed up the book launch immediately after this perfectly with several hints and teases about what's the content of the book. Maybe we're tight enough on time, but we might have time for one or two very short, brief questions. Yeah. Christopher, yeah.
Very quick comment was wow on the paper. It was really impressive, really interesting. The actual question was just how endemic was, because the map you showed where the places where the food riots were going on. Yes. What's the sort of percentage of the number of fairs and towns and places would that have been? Is that 1%, 2%, 5%?
I guess there's a couple of things about the map, because it only refers to those particular 2 months. I was actually comparing with a similar map for the east of Scotland on another occasion. I mean, rural Ireland, it's impossible to answer the question in a place where the population is 80% rural. Rural Ireland was thickly populated. You find attempted mobilizations in the ports where stuff was actually happening. It seems to be concentrated in Munster and in the rural parts, in places where you had a well-developed repertoire of protest among the white boyism and so on. With regard to urban areas, then protest is thwarted in the kind of more traditional places of protest, and people come through the middle, so they do try, and you end up, say, with the Galway crowd blocking the removal of relief, stopping relief work going to Tuam, for example, but in despair when they can't actually stop the grain from leaving. Sorry, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's quite a difficult question. It's quite a difficult thing to quantify. I do make some effort at quantification when I say several 100,000 people were mobilized, and that's based on all the reports of 3 and 4 and 5 here and there in the different places.
Thanks, John. Look, it's 7:30, and I'm just conscious John is on the next session as well, and the book launch is actually meant to start at 7:30, so I don't want to be eaten into the time. So just everybody say thank you to John Cunningham for his excellent talk.